Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Stevens, and I want to talk a little bit about the human body for today. I know it's a snow day, and so I'm going to go over about three-fourths of this lecture, and then the rest of this lecture I'm going to do in person when I see you, hopefully on Wednesday. I'll do a brief recap, and then we'll finish the lecture. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. All right, so what is anatomy and physiology? So anatomy and physiology is a study of the structure and the function of the human body. And so the structure and function are two different things, and we're going to highlight what structure and function is in just a minute. But what is important is that the field of anatomy and physiology is under the umbrella of biology, which means that in order for new things to be discovered, we actually have to test them under the scientific method. And so we're not going to go over the scientific method in any detail, nor will you be tested on it. But the scientific method, as I'm sure you have heard about, involves making an observation, having a hypothesis, coming up with experiments, having a conclusion, and then finally putting up some results, right? This makes it so that anatomy physiology is really a quantitative science, right? Meaning that we're going to be measuring something that is measurable. So, what is anatomy, right? So, we're kind of breaking up anatomy and physiology. And there's two types of anatomy, very, very easy. Keep this in mind, this is sort of a test question, right? So just kind of to know that. Gross anatomy is just things that you can see with your eye, right? So that would be like your hair, your nails, your skin, anything that you can see with your naked eyeball will be considered gross anatomy, right? Microscopic anatomy, on the other hand, is anything that you can't see with your naked eye, right? In fact, in order to see it, you would actually need a microscope. So very simple, right? Gross anatomy, something that you can see with your eye. Microscopic anatomy, something you could not see. So a good example of that would be, let's say, ovums from an ovary, right? Or sperm from sperm, right? You wouldn't be able to see any of those things, right? And I have some other examples that we're going to talk about in the next few slides, right? So this slide is just giving you an example of gross anatomy, right? So you're not responsible for anything particular on this slide, but if we were to crack open a body, you would be able to see the salivary glands, or the stomach, or the pancreas, or the large intestine or small intestine. So again, anything that you can see with your eyeball would be gross anatomy. This is an example of microscopic anatomy, right? So again, if we were sort of to snap our fingers and get inside of the stomach, it would have lots of folds called rugae, which you don't need to know at this point. But if you were to sort of zoom in on those folds, you would actually sort of see these pits. So you can see a pit here. I'll just kind of draw a little right there. And this is kind of showing you kind of a sagittal section of a pit, right? And inside of that pit are kind of lined with cells, as you can see sort of here. And these cells are going to be putting out enzymes and acid that are going to bubble up this pit and sort of come out into the stomach here, right? So this would be an example of microscopic anatomy. And in fact, we can actually zoom in a little bit further, and you can actually see that if we just zoom in on that pit, you can see that the cells that line the pit are actually individual cells that put out different things, right? So this particular cell, called a chief cell, puts out pepsinogen, and this parietal cell puts out hydrochloric acid, right? And all of these are going to help break down proteins, help break down and digest proteins. And again, you're not responsible for like pepsinogen or hydrochloric acid or pepsin at this point. I just wanted you to just have just kind of a general idea of microscopic anatomy. Again, you would never be able to see a parietal cell or a chief cell or even an enteroendocrine cell without a microscope. Okay, so what is physiology? So physiology is very, very, very broad, right? So physiology could be marine physiology, cardiac physiology, hepatic physiology. It could be mammalian physiology, reptilian physiology. So it's extremely diverse. But the physiology is essentially the function of something, right? And uh, So why is it important to know both anatomy and physiology, right? So uh, the reason is because structure determines function, right? And if structure changes, the function must also change, right? I like to use the example of teeth, right? So um, you have canines, which are those pointy teeth, and you also have molars and premolars, which are those flat teeth, right? And if you were a paleontologist and say you knew nothing about, if you had just seen these bones for the very first time, and you look at the teeth of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, you would look at the structure and you would see, um, if you look at the structure of a Tyrannosaurus Rex's teeth, you will see that it has lots and lots of canines. And those canines are going to be used to, obviously, going to be used to shear meat off of bones. Therefore, it's more than likely that the Tyrannosaurus Rex was a carnivore. Conversely, if you were um, to look at the structure of a brontosaurus, which is a very tall dinosaur, most of its teeth are premolars and molars, right? And so you could tell that the function of those teeth will likely be to crush and grind plant material, right? And so therefore, it's more than likely that a brontosaurus would be an herbivore, right? And if you look at our teeth, for example, we have sort of a combination of canines and molars and premolars and incisors. Therefore, we would be an omnivore, right? Very similar to bears, for example. So again, you won't be tested on this, right? Again, I even have it on here, right? Relax this information, won't be tested. But this picture, what you see here consists of four muscles: the vastus lateralis, intermedius, rectus femoris, vastus medialis. And these four muscles actually make up the quadriceps, which is just your thigh, right? The muscles of your thigh, right? And in 2016, that we actually discovered a whole new muscle, right? And it's called the tensor of the vastus intermedius, right? So even though what you see here, this is actually in your textbook, this is actually reality, right? There's actually a new muscle in red here that actually goes in between there, right? And so we actually have five muscles, right? So I always find it's really cool that we are discovering more and more and more things in anatomy and physiology. And so this isn't this the following year, another group sort of cracked open a bunch of cadavers, and they also found the tensor vascular intermedius, right? And so if you may be asking yourself, well, why is this important? Well, it's important because if you discover something, you want another group to be able to confirm it, right? Otherwise, if you're always the one, if you discovered something and no one else discovers it, it may be kind of biased, right? So this having another group confirm what you've discovered sort of adds on and builds on to the knowledge that we have. All right. So again, this is another thing that's a little bit new. Again, it's not that new. This is 1994, and again, some of you have maybe even been born around this time or even after. But there was a new hormone called leptin, and leptin is a hormone that's secreted by fat cells. So the fat cells in your body, they're constantly secreting leptin, and what leptin does is that it will bind to receptors in the brain, and it will make it so that we don't eat, right? And so this sort of the hunger response is that when our fat cells are low, leptin isn't secreted as much, therefore we eat, right? And when our fat cells are filled with fat, they secrete lots of leptin, therefore we don't eat, right? And a good example of this, though I will never test you on this, would be marijuana, right? So the main constituent in marijuana actually blocks the interaction between leptin and its receptor, and therefore people who consume this drug will begin to eat, and they don't just eat protein, for example. They typically would eat high fat foods or high sugary foods, right? And so it kind of gives you this idea how leptin is actually working, right? So again, you're not going to be testing on it. Just wanted you to kind of see how things are kind of discovered in anatomy physiology in sort of an incremental way. This is a study, and again, I particularly like these things, but you can see these two people here, and I'll draw a little arrow here. these two people are the control, right? And these two people have uh, have have normal leptin levels. And what this experiment did was that they found that these three people here, one, two, so kind of a two, and three, these individuals were overweight, and when they were got a blood test, they found that they have very high levels of leptin. In fact, this is not uncommon. Most people who are obese have very high levels of leptin, right? Which is a little bit contradictory because you would think that if someone has high levels of leptin, just as we saw on the other slide, that they would not eat. And the hypothesis was that people who have very high levels of leptin, like insulin with diabetes, are resistant to their own leptin. And so what they did was that that every day that these individuals, starting at zero and going all the way for a year and a half, they were given daily injections of leptin. And what you see is that over time, the weight not only just goes down, right? So you see it goes down here, but it doesn't just go all the way down. It actually sort of levels off, right? And so you can see that really there's really no big difference between what happened, the weight of the individuals at 12 and 18, right? You can see it's about the same here. All right, and if you want to know what this arrow is, that's actually when they started the treatment. So for the very first 2 months, for example, they were told to diet on their own. You can see this individual in yellow sort of dieted on their own, but red, the patient A and C, it looks like A and C, they just started to eat either way, right? So one of the questions I ask here is just that should leptin be available everywhere? And you may say, yeah, it should be available everywhere because everyone will be able to lose weight. Or you may say, well, it shouldn't be available because people could abuse it. Well, those are actually both good answers. But the main reason that you can't buy leptin over the counter is because they found out, and this was about 15 years ago, that leptin actually causes cancer, right? So not causes cancer necessarily, but increases the invasiveness of cancer, right? Which is interesting because if you think about it, the obesity can lead to cancer, and so leptin may be the link, though we don't know that for sure yet. So just kind of keep that in mind the next time that you hear something on the news that says, "Hey, this is going to cure cancer," or "This is going to cure obesity," or "This is going to cure aging," because there could be other side effects that you just don't know about, and you may not know about it until much, much later. And again, this stuff will not be tested, so just kind of keep that in mind. Okay, so this is the sort of the levels of structural organization. So, and again, this is something that is in your review sheet for you to know for the exam. And it reminds me of that Barney song. I don't know if you remember the Barney song. It goes something like, the egg and a nest and a nest and a branch and a branch and a tree and a tree and a hole and a hole in the ground. It's a very good song. I don't know if you've heard of it. But in any case, we are all made out of atoms, and these atoms come together to make molecules. And when these molecules come together, they actually make cells. And when cells come together for a common goal, you have a tissue. And when tissues are working together, you make an organ. And when an organ is working together, you have an organ system. And all these organ systems are working together for the benefit of the organism, you have an organism, right? So atoms, molecules, cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and the organism. And the whole point of this, you're like, what the heck is this for? The whole point of this is so that you understand that the same atoms that are spinning, that make up the pen that you may be holding, or the paper that you have, or the desk that you're looking at, or the computer that's in front of you, the same carbon atoms and oxygen atoms and nitrogen atoms that are spinning within them are the same exact ones that are spinning within you. And it's very wild to really think about, but it's absolutely true, right? So just remember that again, and I can repeat this again, that atoms are sort of the very basic units. If you put a bunch of atoms together, you have molecules. If you put a bunch of molecules together, you have cells. If you put a bunch of cells together, you have tissues. If you have a bunch of tissues working together, you make an organ. If a bunch of organs together working together, you have an organ system. And when all these organ systems are working together for the benefit of the organism, you have an organismal level, right, which is an organism, right, like so, right. So, and this again, these are called the levels of structural organization. And I apologize for how um, squiggly these lines are kind of coming out. It's kind of hard to do it with a mouse. Okay, so let's do a march through the body's organ systems, right? So we're only going to just sort of scratch the surface of each of these organ systems. You're not going to be expected to know every little detail. But the integumentary system consists of the skin. It also consists of the hair, nails, as well as the sweat and oil glands. There also contains cutaneous receptors, right, that are going to be involved in like pain and pressure. It's also going to be involved in synthesizing vitamin D, right, and we get that from the sunlight. And probably most importantly, the tegumentary system is going to cover all of our our external body, right? And so, and this is going to protect our body from injury, right? From like the cold, which is like it is outside, or the heat, or the UV radiation from the sun. The skeletal system is involved in supporting body organs. It's also going to provide the framework for muscles to use movement. And which is, I think, is pretty wild, is that inside of bones, there's bone marrow in which blood cells are going to be formed, right? So it's always something that's really, really cool that we often think of bones as sort of these old or dead things. But in reality, inside of bones, they actually are making the stuff that allows us to live, right? Which are white and red blood cells. Another important function of the skeletal system is to store minerals, and I'm sure that most of you can kind of guess what would be one of the minerals that the bones store, which would be calcium, right? So that will be our skeletal system. And the cartilage here really acts as shock absorbers here, right? And we'll talk a lot about that when we get into the skeletal system later in the semester. The muscular system, so this allows us to manipulate the environment. It allows us to move, right, or locomotion. It allows us to express our emotions through facial expression. It also helps us maintain our posture, and probably most important for the body, right? It produces heat, right? So in fact, if you've ever been cold, or if you've ever had a fever, your brain would send signals to your skeletal muscles, which will then tell them to shiver, and that shivering will cause them to move, and that movement will cause them to release heat, which will then diffuse from the muscle to the blood, which will then warm the blood, which then warms the body, right? So not only does the muscles allow us to move and to express our emotions and to maintain our posture, but it really is our furnace, right? Without our muscles, we would be very, very, very cold. The nervous system is this fast acting rather control system of the body, and really the main kahuna of the nervous system is the brain, and it can send signals down the spinal cord to different nerves. And in fact, though, you don't need to know it at this point, the brain can send signals up to 270 miles an hour, right? So that's really, really, really fast. And typically, when the brain is sending signals, it typically will its end target will typically be muscles, right, to move, or it could be glands, right, to like secrete things, right, like sweat or saliva or gastric juices inside of our stomach. Okay, the endocrine system, these are going to be, so endo, this is going to be sort of inside. So these are going to be glands. So all endocrine, the system, these are all going to be glands, but these are going to be glands that secrete hormones inside of the body, right? So, so an example of these would be like pineal gland, pituitary gland, thyroid gland, thymus, adrenal, pancreas, testes, ovaries. These are all going to be glands that are going to be secrete hormones inside into the bloodstream, where they can act on different tissues, right? So you are not responsible for knowing you're not responsible for knowing what the pineal gland or pituitary gland or thyroid or thymus or adrenal, any of these right now. Um, but you should know that all of these are a part of the endocrine system, right? So do not bog yourself down learning what each of these do right now. We will get to that in a moment. But I can actually tell you a little bit about them, but don't bog yourself up with them. Okay, so your pineal gland is going to be involved in your circadian rhythm, right? They actually secrete this hormone called melatonin. You do not need to know that right now. The pituitary gland is probably the most important endocrine gland because it actually tells all the other glands what to do, right? And in fact, if you look the pituitary gland up on Wikipedia or even in your book, sometimes they refer to the pituitary gland as the master gland or the master ganglion. And the reason they call it the master gland is because it controls all the other glands. The thyroid gland, that's going to be involved in metabolism, right? So if you have an overactive thyroid, you may have very high metabolism. And if you have an underactive thyroid, you may have low metabolism, right? And we will talk a little bit about that later, but just kind of keep a pin on that, and we'll talk about that later in the semester. The thymus gland is really going to be involved in making T cells, which are going to be needed for immunity. They also secrete hormones that are involved in sort of organizing the immune system. The adrenal gland here, that's going to be involved in secreting hormones that are involved in stress. And so stress isn't just, a lot of times we think of stress as just sort of physical stress, but stress could also be mental, right? So maybe if someone made fun of you, or maybe you had a very stressful day at work, or even driving, right? In very kind of condensed traffic, these adrenal gland could put out kind of stress-inducing hormones, and one of those hormones is called cortisol. Though you don't need to know, but just for those who may be interested. The pancreas is a hormone, is not a hormone, a gland that puts out a glandular organ rather that puts out insulin and glucagon. Insulin is going to help lower glucose levels, while glucagon is going to raise glucose levels. So again, you do not need to know these specifically, just kind of giving you a walkthrough, right? And again, the testes and the ovaries, the testes are going to make a testosterone, and the ovaries make estrogen. Okay, and yeah, all right. So that's the endocrine system. Okay, so the cardiovascular system, this is going to consist of the heart and blood vessels, and they're going to be involved in carrying oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and waste throughout the bloodstream. And the pump of this would be the heart, right? So the heart is the pump, and the blood vessels are really sort of the channels, or the tubular channels in which blood is flowing through. The lymphatic system is going to be involved in immunity, right? So you can see it's involved in immunity. It's also kind of the sewage. I always kind of think of the sewage system, or the basement of the body. It's actually linked up to the cardiovascular system, though we'll talk about that later in the semester. But the main role of the lymphatic system is to pick up excess fluid and deliver them back to the blood, right? And sorry for the kind of meant to kind of do it this way there, right? It also disposes of infectious debris like cancer cells or viruses or bacteria, and that will go through these lymphatic vessels, right? You can see these lymph nodes, which are about 600 of them, and some these lymph nodes have millions, if not billions, of white blood cells, and they will swell or get bigger when you are under the when you are have an infection. The respiratory system, this is really your gas exchanger. So again, we are constantly putting out this waste product all the time called carbon dioxide, and we need to remove this carbon dioxide from the blood and refresh that carbon dioxide. We will actually remove the carbon dioxide and refresh the blood with oxygen, right? And this is needed because if we didn't have it, we would die very, very, very quickly, right? So that's the role of the respiratory system. The digestive system is going to be involved in the breakdown. So I can put the breakdown breakdown, and the absorption of food, right? So, digestive system is going to help break down, let's say, glucose, let's say not glucose, but let's say lactose into glucose and galactose, and then you'll be able to absorb that glucose and galactose into the bloodstream, right? So, again, if glucose and galactose scares you, don't worry about it. It's just glucose. Lactose, I'm sorry, is made out of glucose and galactose, right? And anything that your body does not need is actually going to be eliminated as feces, right? Right. Yeah. The urinary system is going to help eliminate nitrogen-containing waste, right? So one of the main waste products outside carbon dioxide that we have in the body is going to be ammonia, right? And we have an abundance of ammonia due to the fact that we're constantly turning over proteins, right? And so we have ammonia, and we will excrete ammonia through the urinary system. And in fact, you may have actually heard of urea. I don't know if you ever heard of that before, but urea is found in urine, and urea is really just sort of bound up ammonia, right? And the urinary system also is going to regulate a water, electrolytes. So again, electrolytes are going to just be like sodium, potassium, calcium, any atom that has a charged that's charged, right, and that we consumed, and it's going to be involved in the acid-base balance of the blood, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the semester. Right, and then you can see the kidney, which are going to be involved in sort of filtering the blood, and then that urine that the kidneys make are going to go down to the ureter, and then it's going to go down to the bladder, and then it's going to be excreted through the urethra and hopefully into the toilet. Okay. Right. So we've kind of went through sort of our march through these systems. And so now we're going to kind of talk about sort of the necessary functions of life, right? So one would be to maintain boundaries, right? So, and the main boundary that we have will be our skin, right? So this makes it so that we don't merge into the next person, right? We also need to be able to move, right? Locomotion, obviously, is to be able to move. And the movement of substances, we don't really see that, but that is actually happens inside of our body. So, for example, when our heart pumps blood, not well, pumps blood, if we were to sort of zoom in on the heart, each one of those cardiomyocytes or each one of those heart cells are actually breathing in a sodium, like, and then exhales potassium. And the movement of that sodium and potassium actually allows it to actually pump, right? um, uh, uh, the other function will be responsiveness, right? So to be able to react to changes. So say if someone if you're asleep and someone wakes you up, or if you get poked by a needle, that responsiveness is very necessary for life, right? If we weren't able to respond, we would be in danger a lot of the time, right? Um, Digestion, again, we kind of talked about this in the other section. Digestion allows us to break down and absorb nutrients, right? And I love the breakdown and absorption, two separate but very important things. You can't digest something if you don't break it down, even if you can absorb it, because you wouldn't be able to absorb it, and you can't absorb something that you haven't broken down, right? So these things are sort of the yin and yang. So some other life functions would be metabolism, right? So metabolism is our ability to break down molecules, right? And another function will be to build larger molecules, right? And it's really breaking down molecules and building up molecules is really what metabolism is, right? And we'll talk a little bit about this later for those who want to know a little bit more. Sometimes we call the breakdown of molecules called catabolism. Not metabolism, but catabolism with a cat, like a meow meow cat, right? And to build up things, we call it anabolism, right? Like anabolic steroids, like the bodybuilders use, right? So anabolism and catabolism are kind of are sort of equal metabolism. And the whole point of metabolism is really to produce energy, right? And to make necessary components for life. And much of metabolism will be regulated by hormones, right? Um, Okay. Um, we have excretion, so we need to excrete waste and metabolic from metabolic reactions, and waste may be removed through urine or feces, right, depending on their fate. And then we also are going to be the other function of life will be to be able to reproduce, right? And this reproduction can either occur on the cellular or organismal level. And the point of this is to produce future generations here. And then growth, right? You know, we came into the earth very, very small as a baby, and we've grown, right? And that growth can either be increase in cell size and cell number, right? So all of these would be functions of life. So there are some survival needs. So the survival needs that we have are going to be nutrients. So we're going to have to need, we're going to have carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. Carbohydrates would be like bread, rice, flour. Proteins would be like meat, like cow or pig or giraffe if you eat giraffe. Uh, and then lipids will be like fats and lipids, or I can't, I'm not gonna, well, fats and oils, for example. And then vitamins and minerals, even though we use these specifically to build things, they're actually needed, right? So we need like vitamin A, B, C, E, K, right? And there's many more. And then minerals like calcium, potassium, sodium, these are all going to be minerals, right? We need oxygen, which I'm sure that you already knew, right? We need that for chemical reactions, and we'll talk a lot about that later. And then we need water, right? So water is sort of this milieu in which we perform most of our reactions. We need a stable body temperature. And that stable body temperature is about 37 degrees C or 98 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, this varies depending person to person. And the atmospheric pressure, that is appropriate for gas exchange. So I think, though you won't be tested, I think atmospheric pressure like 760. Our atmospheric pressure needs to be at that amount for us to actually exchange gases, right? So not so much important now because atmospheric pressure is all going to be constant. But say if we wanted to move to like the moon or Mars or another planet, this is a big consideration to make sure that we can exchange gases with the environment. Um, this is a very simplified view of how the body works with all the different systems. Again, no body looks like this, right? They're kind of drawing it as a cell, but you can see food is being taken in through the digestive system. Nutrients are taken from the digestive system into the blood, and then from the blood, it's pumped to the heart, to the lungs where CO2 is removed, O2 is put into the blood, and then it goes to the urinary system where you're going to remove those waste products. And you can see those waste products are going to go from the kidney to the bladder and be excreted as urine. And then the nutrients, the nutrients and oxygen are going to be distributed to the cells, right, which are underneath here. And the interstitial fluid, which you do not need to know now, the interstitial fluid is just the fluid that's between cells, right? So it's a very weird term, interstitial fluid. We never use that term at all, right? But the interstitial fluid is just simply the fluid that's between the cells, and that's actually where this fluid is actually where the exchange of nutrients and gases and waste products occurs. And again, lastly, nearly lastly, this indigestible waste products are going to be excreted as feces here. You can see that what covers this would be, I'm kind of draw an arrow here, this sort of membrane was actually going to be the integumentary system, which is our skin, which is going to protect the body as a whole. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about homeostasis, right? So homeostasis is the maintenance of a stable internal environment despite changes to the external environment. And so this is going to be necessary for normal body functioning. And so the homeostasis is very, very simple. If you remember, if you have like kind of central air at your house, or if you know someone with central air, if you set the thermostat at 70 degrees, the central air unit will raise the body temp, not body, the raise will heat the home using the furnace, or cool the home using the air conditioner to keep the body at 70 degrees. And that's what homeostasis is, right? So it's the maintenance of the stable internal environment despite changes to the external environment, right? So outside, as I'm looking outside, it's snowing and it's super cold. But if I were to stand outside for 5 minutes, believe it or not, my body temperature would not change that much. And the reason is because our bodies will begin to use these homeostatic mechanisms to keep body temperature up, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about those homeostatic mechanisms. So this is actually from your book, and I think it's a little bit confusing, but I always stick with it because it's in the book, right? But it's kind of showing you a teeter-totter here, and when the teeter-totter is off kilter here, we call that imbalanced, right? And so and when it's sort of here, we call it balanced. And so our body really wants it to be sort of here, right? Not in this imbalanced state, which is going to be here, right? So and I could just kind of do that, right? So so a stimulus could be like cold weather, right? So we'll just use cold. So the stimulus would be cold, and we go outside, and the receptors on our skin will detect that change in temperature, and then that receptor will send signals from the receptor to the control center, and the control center could be the spinal cord, but typically it's the brain, right? So and you wouldn't be too off if you like to think of the control center as the brain. So we'll just call it the brain just for now. But the receptor sends a signal to the brain, and then the brain, so we'll put brain if I can write it. Oh, I'm not even going to try. Let's see, I'm not even going to try. So we'll just call it just the brain here. Um, so the receptor sends a signal to the brain or the control center, and then the brain or the control center will send a signal to the effector, right? And this is going to be sort of an output, right? So input is always going to be afferent, and output is always going to be efferent. You don't need to know that right now, though you will need to know that much later in the semester. How I like to think of it is afferent is accepting, like the brain is accepting input, and efferent, always think of it as like the brain signals are exiting the brain, right? A for accepting, so A is for accepting, and E is for exiting the brain or spinal cord. So again, don't worry about that right now, but just kind of put a pin on that because we will revisit that later in the semester. So that output would lead to an effector. So that effector could be a gland or a muscle or another organ, but and in this case, it typically would be if you're cold, it's going to be a muscle, and that muscle is going to begin to shake to then um, that shaking is going to cause heat to be produced, and that heat is going to warm the blood, right? And that warming of the blood by the shivering is going to turn this imbalanced teeter-totter back into this balanced teeter-totter, like so. Okay, so this is just kind of what I had talked about before in the other slide, that the receptor is going to be involved in responding to changes in the external environment. Is going to send that information to the control center along an afferent pathway. Again, A for accepting because it's accepting input from the outside. The control center can be the brain or the spinal cord, and this analyzes the information, determines the appropriate response, and then it's going to send that information from the control center to the effector along an effector pathway. Uh, um, I'm sorry, efferent pathway. And again, an efferent would be exiting, and an effector is just going to be an organ or a gland. that is actually going to do the response from the stimulus, right? And again, if this seems confusing in word form, I would encourage you just to go back to the other slide to kind of take a look at that. Okay, so homeostatic mechanisms can be negative or positive. The cool thing that we're in our discussion is that most of these mechanisms are going to be negative. So like 90, let's say 98% of them are going to be negative, which means it works very similar to a household thermostat, which means that if you put the thermostat at 70 degrees and it in a temperature of 68, once it gets to 70 degrees, it's going to shut off, right? And that's how our body mostly works through negative feedback, in which the original stimulus is actually reduced in intensity through this negative feedback, right? More rarer, but though just as important, would be positive feedback. So positive feedback is when you have a stimulus, but that stimulus is actually amplified, right? So an example of that would be blood clotting, right? And another example would be sort of the birth of the baby, right? So childbirth, which we'll talk about in just a moment, right? Okay. So, these are some home. So say for example you're cold as it is right now. Some homeostatic mechanisms that occur when your body detects that it's cold will be the shiver, right? And shivering, what happens is that when muscles move, they release heat. That heat warms the blood. That blood is then warming the rest of your body, right? Because it's circulating through the circulatory system, right? So shivering is really one of the important mechanisms here. Goosebumps, which is going, oops, if this thing can, well, yeah, there we go. Goosebumps are going to be the contraction of these erectile pili muscles. So again, through evolution, we've lost a lot of our hair, but what happens is that when we're cold, those erectile pili muscles are contracted, and our hair follicle actually sort of flings up, right? And this flinging or sort of this erection of the hair kind of forms this insulating layer, right, that is going to help prevent heat from escaping, right? Now, probably the most important role in this will be the vasoconstriction, right? So when we're cold, blood vessels will vasoconstrict, which would mean blood is actually going to be pulled to the core of our body. And so when I say the core, I just mean our head, our neck, our torso, and our genitals, right? So if, for example, you are outside, which I hope that you're not, and it's 5 below, what will end up happening is that the blood vessels in your hands and your hands and your feet and your arms and your legs will begin to vasoconstrict, and it would send that blood from those areas to the core of your body, right? And if you may think, why do we want it at the core of our body? Well, the reason you want this blood at the core of your body is because these are where all of your most important organs are, right? Like your brain, your heart, your lungs, your liver, your small intestine. All of these are very important, which means that if you find someone who gets frostbite, they probably are going to get frostbite on their fingers and toes first. The reason is because that's typically where blood, because when you're cold, blood vessels are going to vasoconstrict, and blood is going to leave those areas. Has a tendency to leave those areas first. You can also have frostbite on your ears as well, right? And the reason is, though it's not that important, is because there really is not really a blood supply in the cartilage inside of our ears. Actually, you know what? This I already went over this, so I got to get rid of this slide. And in fact, I'm going to redo that. So we just went over this, right, with the other one. So this is sort of a redundant slide. So just ignore this for right now. Okay, so the other mechanism will be when it's hot, right? So again, in Wisconsin, this probably only happens like 2 weeks out of the year, right? But one of the things that happens is that we begin to sweat, and by sweating, what we're doing is that we're putting water on our skin, and water has this really cool property. And when water evaporates, it's sort of like these little magical things. So when water um, evaporates, it kind of shakes and vibrates. And as it goes from a liquid to a gas, it literally sucks up all the heat around it and it poofs. Right? It's almost like the genie from Aladdin. It's actually really, really cool. And the only thing that does this is water, right? So even if you didn't sweat that much, if someone were to spray you with water and you were to go outside and it's hot, you would still get this effect. You also get the relaxation of those erectile pili muscles, right? So hair, instead of sort of being flung upwards to sort of be erect, the hair actually lay down very flat. And the reason it wants to lay down flat is because it does not want to insulate any heat. It wants the heat from your body to leave across to go across your skin as quickly as possible. And again, this isn't a very big effect because again, through evolution, we've lost a lot of our hair. Um, Finally, we have the opening of blood vessels, which is probably the most important mechanism here. Is called vasodilation, and so what occurs is that the blood vessels in our skin and all of our skin begin to open, and the reason it's opening is that your body wants that hot blood to be as close to the top of your skin as possible, so that your hot blood can diffuse across the heat inside of your blood can diffuse across your skin. And sometimes if you are depending on your skin tone, you may be able to see someone's face kind of red when they're hot, and that's just simply due to blood going to the surface of the skin to try to remove as much of that heat as possible. So again, this is another one. Just kind of forget this one. I actually meant to remove that one, so forget that one because we just went over that one. Okay, so I know the slide is not in your book, so please forgive me, but I think the slide is so awesome that I had to include it. And you have A, I kind of use another one. Let's use purple, right? So you have A and then you have B. And so A is when it's like Wisconsin right now, right? So again, it's super cold. So if it's cold outside, what occurs is that the blood vessels in your skin will vasoconstrict, and it will send blood to the core of your body, right? So you can see if you look at sort of this heat map, the hands are cold, the legs are cold, and most of the heat is going to be situated in the head, neck, torso, abdomen, and genital area here. Okay, and this occurs during cold weather. So I think I can write cold. Ooh, that was painful. And if you're hot, for example, you can see that these capillary sphincters will actually relax, which will allow blood to rush to the surface of the skin, which is going to allow for that heat to dissipate across the surface, right? And this is going to occur when you are going to be very, very hot. And if you look at this heat map, you can see that the tippy top of the surface of the skin is going to be quite red, and that's because this hot blood is rushing to the surface to sort of allow the heat to dissipate. And if you have sweat on the surface of the skin, this process even works more efficiently, right? Because as sweat, which is liquid, goes from a liquid to a gas, is going to kind of suck up all the heat around it as it evaporates. Okay. The other mechanisms, this is a positive feedback. This would be childbirth, right? And so during childbirth, the head of the fetus pushes against the cervix, and that stretch is actually detected by the brain, and that brain will actually put out oxytocin, and that oxytocin will then go to the uterus to cause more contractions, right? And so this is a positive feedback mechanism, which means that this mechanism will not stop until the baby is out, right? And so before there was really modern medicine, many women died during childbirth, right? Because if the baby wasn't in a right configuration, the baby could be stuck, right? In many cases, what will end up happening, as you probably would guess, a cesarean section would have to be performed. And of course, back in those days, before modern medicine, a cesarean section was nearly always fatal, right? And so a woman, and again, it has to be, the baby had to be removed because if you don't remove the baby, both the mother and the baby die, right? And again, oxytocin is this hormone that is going to help is a hormone that is going to drive the contraction of the uterus, and these contractions will get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger until this baby is expelled. And again, the story I told about before modern medicine, again, this was before modern medicine. This is childbirth is very, very safe nowadays, or safer. Okay, so let's talk about the diagnostic study of the human body. And you have your X-rays, which are going to be here. You have your CT scan, X-ray, and you have your CT scan. Sometimes we call it CAT scan, and then you have an MRI here, and then you have an ultrasound, right? And we'll talk about all of these. Right. So X-rays were discovered in 1885, and they penetrate tissues that dart and that they actually penetrate tissues. But typically, the only tissue that you will actually be able to see will be bones, right? The problem with X-rays is that they are very dangerous to DNA. In fact, X-rays are very, very tiny. Therefore, if I were to if I had a mutant power and I were to do X-ray, you would not feel any pain, but much of your DNA could be damaged, right? And the picture that you see, I think, is kind of fun to look at. When they first discovered X-rays, they really didn't know how dangerous they were. So they had these plays and these events where they would just use these X-ray machines as props, right? So imagine watching your favorite shows on Netflix or on Hulu or on Amazon Prime, and while the people in the sitcom are talking, they're being bombarded with X-rays so that you can see their skull and their bones, right? And so it sounds kind of cool, right? You know, kind of a cool thing to add to a show, but it's actually very dangerous. And many of these actors and actresses died of cancer. You have your CT scan. Sometimes we call this a CAT scan. It's very similar to an X-ray. In fact, it actually uses X-rays, but it uses computers to sort of take that X-ray and make sort of this transverse slice here, right? So, yeah. MRI is really, really cool. It's kind of hard to explain, but what's really cool about MRI is that it uses these very powerful magnets, and it's good for soft tissue, right? And what the cool thing about MRI is that we have atoms in our body can either spin left or spin right. I know, right? We are left and right-handed. And when you use an MRI, when you expose the body to these very, very high magnets, it causes all of the hydrogen atoms in our body to spin in one direction, right? And that spinning can actually be detected by this machine, and it gives these very crisp images of the body. And so, if, for example, you have cancer or you have a growth, or maybe you have a foreign body in you, like say you have a nail or a bullet, I hate to say that, but something like that in the body, this MRI can really give the surgeon or the radiologist a very good idea of where that cancer or that foreign body or object is in the soft tissue there. Sonography. So sonography uses sound. So it's kind of cool to think about, but sound, when you talk or you hear someone talk, sound travels in waves. And when it hits a wall, it hits an object, it actually goes back to the speaker, right? I know, right? It's really, really cool. And in fact, there are some animals like bats and dolphins and even whales, right, that use sonar or sonography or sound to kind of look at the world, right? Um, And so if we are trying to look at a baby, for example, we would not use X-rays, right? Because X-rays will damage the DNA. And even though MRIs, they probably don't cause cancer, we don't know that for sure, even though they probably don't. And for a baby, we really don't want to take any chances, right? But we know for sure that sound does not cause cancer, would not do anything bad to the baby. Therefore, sonography for looking at the baby, looking at a baby in utero would be the best choice. Actually, we're not. You're not going to be tested on PET scan. It exists, but I actually forgot to remove this, so we're actually going to just sort of cross this out here. Right? So don't really worry about PET scan. It's just not something that we're going to talk about in class. But do just sort of know that it exists, but don't worry about it otherwise. Okay. The other type of imaging is called the digital subtraction angiography. So what you do with this one is that you take two radiographs, right? You take a radiograph before you inject the heart with a dye, and you take another radiograph after injection with the dye. And then the computer will then overlap these images and subtract the before and after image, and it will give a clear view of the vasculature of the heart. And this is good for doctors or cardiologists in particular to figure out where there is a blockage or narrowing of the blood vessel. Okay, so this is the anatomical position. So an anatomical position is a person standing erect. Their feet is going to be firmly planted on the floor. Their arms are going to be at their sides. The palms are going to be forward. The face is going to be forward. The eyes are going to be forward, right? And so this is the standard frame of reference for anatomical descriptions, even dissections. If you've ever, hopefully you never have to see one, but if you ever get an autopsy report for a loved one or for a family, even if you look up one on the internet, they actually show the body looking just like this, right? Not just like this, but sort of a drawn version of this, right? And this is just simply because this is what we refer to as the anatomical position. So when we think about the anatomy of the body, we assume that the body looks just like this, right? So just kind of keep that in mind. Um, we're going to go over a lot of this in lab, but I will just kind of go over some of these with you. So you have the cephalic region, which is going to be your head, your cervical region, which is going to be your neck, thoracic region, which is going to be your chest, abdominal region, which is going to be like kind of your stomach region, your pelvic region, which is going to be where your pelvis is right here, your inguinal region, which is going to be your groin here. And then you have your upper limbs here, well, yeah, and these are kind of the main ones here, right? And then the pubic region will sort of be your genital region there, right? And we'll talk a lot about that in lab. Uh, and so this is the back. So and I can't go back because I'm doing recording, sorry. But in the other slide, that was really your anterior. So anterior is going to be front, and back, and dorsal or dorsum is going to be back, right? And you can see the same thing on this side as well. So when we're looking at the body regions, you have an axial region and the appendicular. So axial region, you probably like, this is probably your favorite region. I know it's mine. It's your head, neck, and trunk, right? And so again, something that we call our trunk, our body core. And again, our trunk is going to be our chest, our abdomen, and our entire back, right? You guys know what your trunk is, so I'm not going to go that much into it. And the appendicular, I feel like is very, very easy. It's just your limbs, right? It's your arms and your legs, right? It's your upper limbs and lower limbs, which include your arm, your forearm, your wrist, your hands, and your fingers. And your lower limbs are going to also going to be including your thigh, your leg, your ankle, your foot, and your toes. So so again, we'll talk about a lot about this in lab, but again, superior is going to be toward the head. Inferior is going to be toward the feet or to the lower part of the body. Ventral is going to be front, right? And again, ventral, anterior, front are all synonyms. And again, I'm actually going to pause and emphasize this because it's important because a lot of students will get this confused. Ventral, anterior, and front are all going to be the same, right? Dorsal, posterior, and back are all going to be the same, right? And it's a little confusing because depending on what text you read, they may flat out say ventral dorsal on one side, on one paragraph, and then flip up and say anterior posterior in the next paragraph. So it's a little confusing, but just know that again, ventral, anterior, and front are going to be the same. Dorsal, posterior, and back are going to be the same. Again, if you're going into vet tech, dorsal, uh, uh, these will not be the same. Again, you can actually read that here. All right. So, but again, if you're not going into vet tech, they aren't they are if you're not going into vet tech, they will all be the same. But in our purpose, they are all going to be the same, right? So just keep that in mind there. Okay, medial. So if I were to kind of draw a face here, which don't laugh at my face, we can actually draw a line, ooh, very bad line, that kind of cuts our body in half. And you can kind of see that line here. I don't know if you can see that there, right there. And anything that's toward the midline right there will be medial, and anything that's going away from the midline would be lateral, right? Intermediate is going to be something that's going to be more medial or lateral to a structure. Don't tell anyone, but I'm not going to test you on this one, right? So just kind of is our little secret, right? But do know that it's going to be between something. I'm not going to test you on that. Proximal is going to be something that's going to be closest to the core, right, or closest to the trunk. And again, proximal and distal, which is going to be, I think, in the next slide, are going to be referring to limbs. Okay. And again, we'll talk a lot about this in lab, right? So don't get too bogged down on this just yet. Okay, and again, here's distal as I promised. Distal um, is going to be away from the trunk, right? So again, and again, an example would be if I were to ask you, what is more distal, your knee or your foot? Well, your foot will be more distal. The example here, they say the knee versus the thigh, and again, if you're trying to think like which is more away from the core or your trunk, and again, between the knee and the knee is going to be more distal, right? Yeah. And then superficial and deep, that should be, I think, pretty intuitive. Superficial is going to be closest to the surface of the body, and deep is going to be away from the body or more internal. Okay, these are just the directional terms here. Again, I'm not going to belabor this anymore, other than just to say that that we're going to have our ventral, dorsal are going to be kind of ventral and dorsal and posterior and anterior kind of synonymous pairs there. Superior, inferior, top, bottom, proximal, distal. Proximal is going to be closest to the core. Distal is going to be away from the core. Medial is going to be closest to the midline. Lateral is going to be away from the midline. Again, superficial is going to be closest to the skin. Deep is going to be away from the skin. And then the rest of these, they're not that important. Cephalic is going to be toward the head. Rostral is going to be toward the back. Caudal is going to be toward the back as well. But let me, yeah. Caudal is going to be posterior there, and you can actually see that right there. Okay, so this is if you're kind of cutting the body. So if I ever ask you what plane or anatomical plane, it's always going to be median, frontal, or transverse, right? And so again, a median could be called mid-sagittal. Sometimes it could be called sagittal, right? So so just kind of keep in mind sometimes in biology there's multiple words for the same thing, so you just kind of have to figure that out. I will always refer to it as sagittal or median, so just kind of keep that in mind, and I'll talk more about that in class. Frontal is going to be frontal. So median is if you're cutting someone left and right. Right. So if you were to take a sword and you were to cut me like along, like you were to separate me to the left and right halves, that would be a median or a sagittal cut. A frontal cut is if you're separating the front and back of someone, right? And transverse would be if you're cutting, if you're separating the inferior top and bottom, right? So again, transverse is top and bottom. Frontal is going to be front and back. A median is going to be left and right. And again, frontal, you can also think of it instead of being front and back, you could also think of it as being ventral and dorsal or anterior and posterior. I know, right? So just kind of keep that in mind there. Okay. And then kind of here we go. Here I just kind of everything I just said was there. So sagittal will be kind of left and right. Um, and again, frontal is going to be anterior and posterior. So again, anterior is front, posterior is back, and transverse is going to be top and bottoms, right? So that will be top will be superior, inferior would be bottom there. Okay, and this is kind of giving you, this is just sort of what we just talked about just now, right? Yeah, and you can, what I will just point out is just sort of this midline that's sort of going across, even though it's kind of, actually, I'm going to leave. I don't like my midline. I'm just going to leave that alone. But if you see the midline here, the midline is going down here, and anything toward the midline is medial. Anything away from the midline is lateral, right? So if I were to ask you, what is more medial, your eyes or your nose, right? Well, your eyes are going to be here, and your nose is going to be here. Well, the medial is going to, most medial would be your nose, right? In fact, you really can't get any more medial than your nose or your belly button or your mouth, really. Okay, so these are your body cavities and membranes. So you have a cranial cavity and a vertebral canal, a thoracic cavity, abdominal cavity, and a pelvic cavity. Many times we may refer to the abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity as one. So you can actually see here that you refer to the abdominal pelvic cavity, right? And it consists of these abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity here, there. All right. I could ask you what organs are going to be found. So again, the organ in the cranial cavity would be your brain. The organ in or the structure in the vertebral canal would be your spinal column. The structure or the organs there in your thoracic cavity would be like your heart and lungs and your trachea. Your abdominal pelvic cavity would be sort of your gut, right? Your small intestine, your large intestine, your pancreas, and so on and so forth. Right? And this is just kind of a continuation on to the other slide. These are your abdominal quadrants. So just kind of take a look at these. So again, if it's quadrants or regions, quadrants are just four, 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, this is just so. For example, if you have an appendix, they probably are going to be trying to. They probably will feel on your right lower quadrant rather than your left upper quadrant, right? And so, and if you ever look at some of your medical records, they may say patient complains of right upper quadrant pain, right, which will give the doctor an idea of what organ or what muscle or what structures may be affected there, right? The abdominal pelvic region can also be broken up into regions as well, right? And so you have epigastric, umbilical, and hypogastric region. Sometimes we call this the pubic region as well, or the inguinal region. And this is your hypochondriac, lumbar region, and inguinal region here, right? And so this is going to be your left region, and this is going to be your right. Wait, actually, this would be, oops, I'm looking at it differently. This is your right. Actually, let me just erase this. Use this eraser so I can find it. and this would be your right, and this would be your left. There we go. And we've kind of, so one thing that you should think about here is that the dorsal body cavity here is going to be, uh, I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. The dorsal cavity is going to consist of your cranial and spinal cord, spinal cavity. So again, dorsal is back, ventral is front. How I like to think of this is too is that imagine if you were to ask for if you found a magic lamp and you're like, I want a dorsal fin. I know, a very weird thing to ask. And the genie gave you a dorsal fin. The dorsal fin wouldn't be in the front. It likely would be in the back, right? So if you had a dorsal fin, it will be in the back there, right? Not in the front, right? So dorsal is going to be back, ventral is going to be front, and again, dorsal posterior back are the same thing, ventral anterior front are going to be the same thing. Okay, so and again, I've already kind of talked about this before in the other one as well. So I'm just going to move on. And again, I've talked about this. What's in the thoracic cavity? Your heart, lungs um, are going to be in there, and these are the organs that would be in your abdominal pelvic cavity, right? So just being able to recognize just one or two of these should be sufficient. We just talked about things. So again, you have 9 regions and 4 quadrants. Again, these are the quadrants. So again, if you have right lower quadrant pain, a very intense pain, it may be an appendix issue, right? So you may say, oh gosh, or if it's right upper quadrant pain, it may be a gallbladder issue, right? Or if it's left quadrant pain, it may be a stomach issue or a spleen issue, even though you can't see the spleen there, right? Or if it's a left quadrant issue, it may be an issue with the colon here, which would be your descending colon right there. Right. So this is just going over what we just talked about. And so some other cavities include the oral and digestive cavity. So the oral cavity is going to contain the teeth and the tongue. And this cavity is going to be continuous with the digestive system, which opens to the exterior to the anus. And then you have your nasal cavity, which is going to be located within the posterior of the nose, right? So again, our nose is in the front, but behind our nose is the nasal cavity, right? And this is going to allow for air to be exchanged with the respiratory system, right? You need to get rid of that CO2 and refresh the blood with that O2 or oxygen. The orbital cavities, which I'm sure you already know, the orbital cavity is really just our eye sockets, right? And inside of these eye sockets or orbital cavities, you're going to have the eyeballs. And then the middle ear cavity, which is sort of the redheaded stepchild, is going to be inside of our ear, and these contain teeny bones that help transmit sound. And we'll talk a lot about that when we get to the special senses section. Okay, so hopefully this has all been helpful. So hopefully read chapter 1, start chapter 2, and if you feel comfortable, I will consider doing the online quiz for chapter 1. When I see you, hopefully on Wednesday, if there isn't another snow day, I will do a brief review of this. We'll do an activity, and then we'll go right into chapter 2. Okay, so hopefully this has been helpful. Okay, take care. Bye.